Today we're talking solo travel, and let me tell you, it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart.
Definitely a different pace than our usual deep dives.
You got that right. We've got this really cool podcast we're dissecting today, all about why everyone should try solo travel at least once. And it really got me thinking, especially after reading this article about a woman who hiked the entire Pacific Crest Trail completely solo.
2,650 miles. Wow. That's intense.
Right. Talk about inspiring, but before we unpack that, I'm curious, have you ever traveled solo?
You know, I haven't. I've always been more of a planet with a group kind of traveler. What about you?
I've dabbled. Took myself on a weekend road trip a while back. But both the podcast and that Pacific Crest Trail article, they really highlight the freedom of solo travel. It's all about you, no compromises, just pure, unadulterated you time.
And that freedom, it can be a bit daunting, don't you think?
Yeah.
But also incredibly empowering. The podcast mentioned how facing challenges alone, it builds resilience. Like that hiker, she said, hitting rock bottom out there, alone. It completely changed her perspective.
Yeah, that really resonated with me. It's like you have no choice but to rely on yourself, figure things out. I guess that's where the self-discovery comes in, right?
Exactly. You're stepping outside that comfort zone, pushing your own boundaries. You know, one thing I found interesting was how the podcast talked about solo travel actually making it easier to meet people. Seems counterintuitive, right?
It does. I always thought traveling alone would make me feel more isolated. What's the logic there?
Well, think about it. When you're solo, you're more approachable. You're not caught up in a group dynamic. So you're more likely to strike up conversations with locals, connect with other travelers. You're open to those chance encounters.
That's a really good point. I remember on my solo trip, I ended up having dinner with this lovely couple I met at a bookstore. We never would have crossed paths if I was with a group.
Exactly. Those are the kinds of experiences you remember. Of course, we can't talk about solo travel without addressing the elephant in the room. Safety.
Absolutely. It's a valid concern, especially for first-timers. But the podcast made an interesting point about not letting fear paralyze you.
Right. It emphasized the importance of research and planning. There are tons of resources out there, like travel forums, apps for sharing your location, even websites where you can find accommodations with reviews from solo travelers.
Like Hostel World, for example. That's a great one. So it's about being prepared, not paranoid.
Exactly. Trusting your gut is key, too. If something feels off, it probably is.
And it's important to remember, solo travel doesn't have to mean being lonely. In fact, the podcast argues that it can be quite the opposite.
Absolutely. It's about embracing solitude,
Yeah.
using that time for introspection, self-reflection. The podcast told this story about a guy who rediscovered his passion for photography on a solo trip. He finally had the mental space to just observe, to connect with his surroundings.
It's funny how being alone can actually help you connect with yourself on a deeper level, isn't it?
It's like that old saying, wherever you go, there you are. Solo travel just strips away all the distractions and forces you to confront yourself, for better or for worse.
So it's less about escaping life and more about diving headfirst into it, huh?
Exactly. And who knows, you might even come back with a newfound talent, like photography.
Solo travel, a catalyst for self-discovery, an adventure for the soul, and maybe even a crash course in photography. Who knew?
So next time you find yourself with a free weekend, why not take yourself on a little solo adventure? Explore a nearby town, check out that museum you've always wanted to visit, try that new restaurant you've been eyeing. You never know what you might discover.